Hello students, I am Dr. Saliha Jamal, Faculty Department of Geography, Aligarh Muslim University, Aligarh. So again we are here for the course Climate Change Vulnerability and Adaptation, and today's topic of discussion is economic vulnerability to climate change. So in this week in the lecture series, we are generally discussing the different types of vulnerabilities to climate change. So in previous classes already we have discussed the different types of vulnerabilities in short, but in this lecture we are going to discuss economic vulnerability to climate change in detail. So let us start this class. Economic vulnerability. When we talk about the economic vulnerability to climate change, mainly it refers to degree of likelihood, or we can say the susceptibility to which an economy is susceptible to the negative impacts of climate change. Means that is likelihood that for the particular economy, that how much it can be impacted through the negative changes that may come through the climate change. This may include certain weather events like gradual shifts in climate patterns, maybe the hurricanes, maybe the temperature changes, etc. And this is associated also to the cost of adaptation and mitigation, because if we want to make any region, any community or the ecosystem resilient to the climatic changes, it is but obvious for that certain economic, or we can say financial stability is very important for the community, for the region, for the nation. So, economic vulnerability effects of climate change can significantly disrupt economies by affecting the key sectors and reducing the productivity, increasing cost and threatening livelihoods. When you see these things, key sectors that mainly this, if we are talking about the economic vulnerability, so it disrupt the economies. So mainly the key sectors you can take here example of agriculture. Agriculture is dependent on climate. We can take example of fisheries. It is dependent on climatic factor. We can take the example of lumbering, also dependent upon the climate. So it affects the key sector. For example, here we are taking for the agriculture, if it is affected by the climate change, for example extended drought time, even for more than 2 years, 3 years, certainly the crop yield will decrease, due to which the food prices will rise, the productivity will be reduced, cost will be increased, thus threatening the livelihoods of the people who are merely engaged to these sector. So that's why we can say here the climate change can impact economic vulnerability. So several factors contributes to the economic vulnerability. Whenever we talk about the vulnerability, we have to deal with the community or any population, how much vulnerable it is. We have to also deal with the region or any ecosystem we are talking about, that how much it is vulnerable, whether physically, economically, or we can say socially. So here there are several factors which contribute to the economic vulnerability. Such factors can be seen in terms of the structure of the economies. What type of economies is this, whether it is directly or indirectly related to the climatic changes, their dependency on the climate sensitive sectors. Already I have given the example like agriculture, fisheries, they are mainly the climate sensitive sector. Even the ecotourism, that is also a climate sensitive sector. And also on the financial and institutional capacity to cope with the climate risk. This is very important. When we talk about the financial and institutional capacity, mostly what we see, the developed world, the developed countries, they have more access to the resources, they have good insurance strategies, so their population is more, we can say they are less susceptible to the changes or risk related to the climate change as compared to the communities living in the low income groups. So developing countries of the world are more vulnerable to economic losses. Why it is more vulnerable to economic losses? Because their economy mainly depends upon primary sector, or either we can say primary and secondary sector also, which is mostly related with the primary sector, like food agro based industries, etc. So if there is disruption in the primary sector, so certainly the related secondary sector will also suffer. So mainly the developing countries and underdeveloped world are more vulnerable because they are more dependent upon the primary sector of economies. So here I would like to quote some example of the economic sector that are more vulnerable to the climate change. Already I am giving a lot example about the agriculture, that it is one of the most climate sensitive sector. When we talk about agriculture, it is one of the most climate sensitive sector, and mostly the developing economies rely heavily on the agriculture. And also we know about the India, the major population, that agriculture sector provide almost employment to more than 50% of the population of the India. So here the climate change can lead to unpredictable rainfall patterns, prolonged drought, floods, thus changing the growing season. All of this will negatively affect the crop yields and the livestock. If rainfall pattern is changed, the crop productivity, or you can say crop yield, will be affected. Simply prolonged droughts will lead to either the, we can say, crop failure or least productivity of the crops. Floods may damage the crops and even the infrastructure that is needed for these practices. Changing growing season may impact the productivity of the crops. All these things are negatively, they impact the crop yields and the livestock. So this will result into reduced agricultural output, higher food prices and increased poverty, especially for small land holding farmers, because they cannot afford, even they do not have the financial stability, so they can cope up through these risks, or they can have certain resource access in order to adapt to proper climatic changes. Another sector of economy which is climate sensitive is fisheries and aquaculture. When we talk about the rising ocean temperatures or ocean acidification, actually ocean acidification is a process where carbon dioxide is absorbed by the ocean water, thus increasing its acidic content. That is known as ocean acidification, which highly affects not only the phytoplanktons, the growth of the phytoplanktons, but also on the zooplanktons and fishes which are dependent on those phytoplanktons. Ocean acidification also affects the bleaching of coral reefs. So fisheries and aquaculture, that is what? That is climate sensitive economy. So rising ocean temperature, either ocean acidification and changing marine ecosystem will surely lead to decline in the fish stocks, directly impacting the communities which are dependent on fishing, or the economies which is reliant on fisheries and aquaculture. The coastal region that depends mainly on the fishing, or the communities which is residing around these water bodies, are mostly dependent on fishing for their own food and even for their income also. So they are highly vulnerable to these changes. Mainly the small scale fishermen are particularly at risk. Here you can take example at Peruvian coast. If you remember, we have seen that ocean current map. So at Peruvian coast, actually in normal situation there is cold current, but at the gap of 5 to 7 years, sometimes the warm currents appear. Due to that warm currents, the anchovy population decreases, on which these anchovy population are dependent upon the phytoplanktons. So due to the warm current, temperature rises for that place, phytoplanktons decreases, and the anchovies which are dependent on these phytoplanktons, they are decreased, and in turn the fishes which are more bigger fishes which are dependent on these anchovy and phytoplanktons, their population also reduces. So at Peruvian coast, where mass death of fishes changes is observed during El Nino, fishermen and their livelihoods gets adversely affected. So this is what here we can say direct impact of climate change to the sectors which are mostly climate sensitive. Similarly, tourism is also somewhat we can say climate sensitive sector, because many regions that depend upon tourism, especially we are talking about here the ecotourism and coastal tourism, these are economically vulnerable to the climate change. For example, rising sea levels, or we can say the coral reef degradation, already I have talked about the increased frequency of extreme weather events like hurricane, storm surges, or even we can say shrinking of glaciers. This will reduce the tourists run to the particular places, particularly to the coastal tourism, and can deter tourists and harm tourism related industries. Another sector which is very much climate sensitive is forestry. Forestry plays a very important role not only managing in climate, because it is a natural carbon sink. It stores carbon, it uses carbon dioxide from the atmosphere for the purpose of photosynthesis in the presence of sunlight. So it reduces the level of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But the climate change is also affecting forestry through increased risks of wildfires. These wildfires may be through the rise of temperature, or maybe many times through the human driven, or maybe due to the prolonged heat or dry conditions we can say. Certain pest outbreaks also take place due to the climatic changes in forest that may change the changing growth conditions, or that may impact these forests. So economies that depends upon the forestry, especially the people, the communities which is living in the close vicinity of the forest, they are mainly dependent for their livelihoods from for the resources that they receive from that they take from the forest. Like the timber production will be reduced. Simply disrupt supply, it will disrupt supply chains, and this may also lead to the loss of biodiversity. So especially the people who are living in proximity of the forest are more dependable on forest resources for wood, timber, or for certain livelihood, and thus they are more vulnerable to the climate change. Secondly, economic vulnerability to extreme weather events. How this economic vulnerability can be seen for extreme weather events. There may be certain natural disasters through the climatic changes like hurricanes, floods, droughts and heat waves that can cause severe economic changes. These changes may be brought through the destruction of the infrastructure, road, bridges, transportation network that will disrupt the transportation, damages to the property, and may also hinder the business activities. So these are the extreme weather event, how they are damaging the particular sectors of the economy. Secondly, if we want to mitigate, the cost of rebuilding or the cost of recovery from the particular event is very much enormous, which the less developed countries or even the developed countries with limited financial resources cannot cope up. So they become more vulnerable. Similarly, if we are talking about the infrastructure damage in terms of the critical infrastructure like roads, bridges, energy system, water supply networks. So, if the damage to this type of infrastructure occurs, not only the particular infrastructure is damaged, but the related activities gets disrupted. For example, if the road bridges are damaged, then there may be the disruption in the transportation activities. So that's why these infrastructure should be properly maintained and should be constructed with the strong material. So economies with age old or poorly designed infrastructure are particularly vulnerable to withstand with the certain extreme events or climate related shocks. Talking about the insurance cost, insurance cost play a very important role in providing stability, in securing the loss of the people, the financial loss of the people. But the areas, the region which are most prone to the shocks of climate change, there the insurance rate is rising. There the rise in the premium rates can be seen, even higher cost for the business and the homeowners. So there the insurance is nowadays becoming unavailable, or even we can say unaffordable. So that is the major problem that is being faced by such vulnerable countries or the regions, etc. Thirdly, how the geographical factors affects the economic vulnerability. For example, this we will be explaining through the example. Suppose we take small islands developing state. These are mostly economically vulnerable to the climate change. Why these small island developing states are mostly vulnerable, or we can say economically vulnerable to climate change? Because they rely heavily on the primary sector, or we can say the climate sensitive sectors like tourism, fishing, agriculture, and which are highly sensitive to the changes in the climate. The rising sea levels, coastal erosion, increased frequency of extreme weather events can devastate these industries and can reduce land available for productive use. Similarly, if we talk about the coastal economies, we can see here that it is mainly affected by the sea level rise or storm surges, hurricanes or coastal floodings. Often these coastal areas remains densely populated. Why? Because it is economically very significant for fishing purpose, or so many times for certain type of agro-based industry, etc. So these coastal areas are economically significant. That's why many times these are densely populated. With the many times the people are also engaged in the tourism industry, shipping industry, real estate business, etc. So these may be impacted through the climatic changes, and also the economic cost of protecting or relocating the infrastructure of the communities may be immense if it is needed. If we talk about the economies which are related to the arid and semi-arid regions, we know that the arid and the semi-arid regions are already prone to drought and water scarcity. Means their agricultural productivity will be reduced. That will pose a greater economic challenge as the climate change will exacerbate. It will also reduce water availability, due to which certain administrative conflicts may arise. It will reduce energy production like hydropower due to the water scarcity, and even the industrial activities can be hampered if it hampers the energy production. So this can lead to the economic losses and conflicts over the water resources. So the problems for the different locations are different. Here where we were saying the geographical factors for mainly for the small island developing states, the problems are different as they are heavily dependent upon the tourism, fishing and agriculture. Similarly, for the coastal economies, the problems were different because they are mainly impacted by the sea level rise and hurricanes. Similarly, for the arid and semi-arid region, due to the prolonged scarcity of water, they are facing problems. So here the problem is again different. So another important key factor which is responsible for economic vulnerability to climate change is the poverty and inequality. For example, low income countries. Why we are talking about here low income countries? Because they lack financial resources to invest in climate adaptation and mitigation measures. There are certain preparedness plans that is needed in order to adapt or mitigate for climate changes, that will always need financial assistance. Suppose a reallocation of certain economies or reallocation of the whole population is needed, that will require immense amount of finances. So that is not very much possible for the low income countries. If it becomes possible, if the country gives a proper financial assistance for this climate get themselves more prepared for the climatic shocks, then those financial assistance may be shortened from the other sectors, like they may struggle to recover from climate related disasters, and economic burdens may lie on the other sectors, maybe in the healthcare sector, maybe in the education sector, etc. So it becomes very much difficult for the low income countries to cope up with the mitigation measures because they lack access to financial resources. Similarly, if we talk about the inequality, economic inequality can exacerbate vulnerability because the marginalized and low income population often lack access to various resources that may help to adapt climate risk. While if we talk about the wealthier individuals or the businessmen, they are better equipped to recover with the resources through which they can recover through the disaster. They may also relocate themselves if necessary, but that is not possible for the poor people, and they may also invest in protective measures like flood defenses, air conditioning, etc. That is not possible with people with low income level. Similarly, similar is the condition for the poor communities which are more exposed to climate risk and may face higher economic losses relative to their limited assets. So, overall poverty and inequality, this is also a key factor responsible for the economic vulnerability. Now, we are talking about the cost of adaptation and mitigation. Talking about the adaptation cost, as the impact of climate change become more pronounced, like governments and business will need to invest heavily in adaptation strategies in order to protect the economies and livelihoods. Whenever we move for certain implementations of the plans, or we can say in order to make community people more resilient to the certain shocks, climate driven shocks, it is but obvious that governments and business, they have to invest heavily in these adaptation strategies in order to protect the economies and livelihoods of the people and the country. And the cost will include building climate resilient infrastructure, means strong infrastructure we are talking about, improving water management and developing early warning systems for natural disaster. This one is very important because early warning system can save many things, most important the human life. For the low income countries, if we talk, they have financial burden for the adaptation, and for them it can be overwhelming, and they need external financing from international organization in order to implement these strategies to protect their economies and livelihood. Then mitigation cost. When we talk about the cost of adaptation, there is cost for the mitigation, means here most common example is transitioning to a low carbon economy. What it will require? The significant investment, because particularly for the industries and countries which are heavily dependent upon the carbon economy, particularly on the fossil fuels. So, if we are going to shift from the renewable energy to the sustainable energy, or we can say towards we are shifting from the towards sustainable agriculture, or we are shifting towards low emission transportation, that will be expensive and that will require initial high cost, particularly for the countries with limited technology capacity. So, already we know that transitioning or shifting towards the cleaner energy and all, these changes are very much essential for long term sustainability, but still they pose short term economic burden, mainly especially to the poor and developing countries. Trade and global supply chains, that is also very much vulnerable. Economic vulnerability can be seen in the disruption of global supply chains. If the infrastructure gets damaged, that will affect the transportation network. ports, or we can say production facilities, maybe due to the certain events like hurricanes, floods, which can also halt the shipping routes and can also damage the critical infrastructure, which will lead to delay in the supply chain, and thus the cost of the products may increase. This type of vulnerability is very much significant for the countries which are highly integrated into global trade system, or which are generally, they rely heavily on the imports and exports. So they have to plan certain strategies in order to mitigate for the transport and global supply chains. Similarly, if in terms of the agricultural trade we see, if a certain climate shock is observed by the agricultural sector, certainly the productivity will reduce, that will lead to the fluctuation in food prices and also the prices in trade, and that will affect mainly the countries who are dependent on food imports, mostly vulnerable to the price shocks resulting from the climate induced crop failures, or even from the supply chain disruption in major agricultural exporting nations. So countries who are more dependent on the agricultural imports, that will be affected. Similarly, the economies which are mainly reliant on exporting agricultural good may face reduced revenue, as changing climate condition can impact yield and quality. That's why there is need to diversify the economy, both who imports the agricultural goods and both who exports the agricultural products. Mainly for the countries who are fossil fuel dependent, how the economic vulnerability is assessed. You can see the economies that are heavily dependent upon the fossil fuel production and export, like mainly on the oil, coal, natural gas, they face significant economic risks as the global efforts to reduce greenhouse gases emission is intensifying. So those economies who are heavily dependent upon the fossil fuels on one side, and on the other side we are going for the efforts which to reduce the greenhouse gas emission. So this effort of reducing the greenhouse gas emission will impact the economies of the countries which are mainly dependent on the fossil fuels. So those economies need to adapt the or shift their fossil fuel dependency towards the renewable energy, or we can say low carbon technologies, which may reduce the fossil fuel demand. So these countries also need to diversify their economies who used to export these fossil fuels, because once the demand for fossil fuels is reduced, so the economies of the fossil fuel exporting countries will be affected. So they also need to diversify their economies in order to mitigate the risks of stranded assets and declining fossil fuel market. So diversification of economy is very much important. We are proceeding in the era of renewable energy transition, because lots of repercussion, or we can say negative impacts of climate change we are seeing day to day in through the different types of events like hurricanes, or we can say heat waves, global temperature rise, etc. So generally the countries that invest in renewable energy technologies may face short-term economic challenge, but in long term it will be beneficial. That is, shifting from renewables require significant investment in infrastructure, research and development. So we can say a short-term economic challenges will be felt for those countries, but in long term it will be benefited, because low carbon economy such as energy they will become energy independence and can reduce the exposure of volatile fossil fuel markets. So that is also very important. And lastly, insurance and risk management. If we talk about the insurance gap, many countries and even the industries, they face significant challenge in managing financial risk of climate related disasters, because in the areas, in the countries where climate risks are high, insurance costs have also risen, and in many cases insurance has become unaffordable or even unavailable. So this leaves businessman, or we can say industrialist, even the homeowners unprotected, increasing their economic vulnerability to climate events. So we can say here that economic vulnerability to climate change is shaped by n number of factors, various interrelated factors like dependence of economy to climate, mainly the certain climate sensitive sectors like agriculture, fisheries, etc., or exposure to the extreme weather events like the coastal areas for the hurricanes and flooding, mainly the geographical characteristics like mountains, coastal areas, island, etc., and also the poverty and inequalities. So these are what we can say, these are the economic vulnerability to climate change, which is mainly shaped by the interrelated factors. So as we see, the global economy is facing increasing climate risk, mainly the proactive investment in adaptation and mitigation strategies is becoming very much essential. Why it is essential? In order to reduce the economic losses and also to promote the resilience. And how we can promote this resilience? Through the steps like diversifying the economies, which means certain region or certain country or community should not rely whole soul on the climate sensitive economies. So there is a need to diversify the economies, there is a need to invest in sustainable practices, although the initial cost may be high, but in long term it will benefit, and also access to the climate finance through the insurance or etc. So, after understanding what economy vulnerability is and what are the factors which are responsible for the economic vulnerability, it becomes important to analyze the economic vulnerability, which is known as economic vulnerability analysis. And generally the process involves the assessing of how exposed an economy or a region or a population is to economic risk and shocks, which the degree of exposure, how much exposed the particular economy is to the particular climate driven shocks. Then one assessment for the exposure is done. Then we have to evaluate the ability of that entity, what is the potential or what is the capacity of the particular sector, particular economy, particular community in order to recover from these shocks. How much potential is there for a particular sector, economy or community to recover from the shocks related to the climate change. Then we have to identify the key weaknesses in strong economic structure. What are the key weaknesses? Whether it is wholesale dependent upon the climate, we can say. So what are the weaknesses? Whether the infrastructure is poorly maintained, poorly built, age-old infrastructure is present. That's why we have to identify the key weakness. Then only we can provide insights for strengthening the resilience. So for this economic vulnerability analysis, again we need certain components or indicators for economic vulnerability analysis. For these components, first we have to identify the vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities where an economy, sector or a certain population is vulnerable to external risk or internal risk, means particular sector or community is vulnerable to the internal risk or external risk, that we have to identify. Then we can assess the exposure and shocks, that is to evaluate the degree to which a particular country, region or group is exposed to different types of economic shocks. That shocks may be price fluctuation, that shocks may be political instability, maybe trade disruption, etc. That is the assessing the exposure shocks. Then we have to assess the resilience. That is simply what resilience means. Resilience generally refers to the ability of any economy or a group to absorb, adapt, mitigate and recover from the shocks. What is the ability, what is the capacity of the economy in this context in order to adapt or recover from the shocks. It will include the factors like economic diversification, institutional strength, etc. After assessing resilience, we can evaluate structural weakness. What are the weakness of the particular economic structure, maybe in terms of the location factors, poverty, inequality, dependence on the volatile sector, etc. And lastly, we can go for the policy and strategic recommendation. The final step in economic vulnerability analysis is to recommend strategies to reduce vulnerability and enhance resilience, which will involve economic diversification, means not only dependent on particular single economy, then strengthening institutions through the good infrastructure, well managed and maintained infrastructure, financing system, insurance system, and also building a social safety nets. So these are the important things that we have to memorize, we have to understand regarding the economic vulnerability to the climate change. Firstly, what is economic vulnerability? Which are the key economies which are climate dependent? Which are the key factors which increases the economic vulnerability to climate change? Then economic vulnerability analysis is also necessary in order to reduce the impact and provide resilience through certain strategies. So that's all for today's lecture. Thank you. Have a nice day.